Hi, this is Paul. By now, I've posted my first conversation with Jeff Quackenbush. Jeff contacted me fairly early on, and he and I have been corresponding on and off via email about a whole variety of things. Jeff struck me as a pretty smart guy, and had a lot of differences of opinion. We had some commonality, some common connection in Grand Rapids, although he didn't grow up in any relationship with a Christian Reformed church. His father was an atheist. His mother was more into New Age stuff. And in the conversation that he and I had, which was I thought quite fun, he had a couple of challenges for me. So I told him to write them down an email, and I would take a look at them, and I would make some videos about them, and they could come back to me, and we could see how this goes. So let's give it a try. So this is the challenge that Jeff gave me. The first one was what I'll call death by industry. He writes this. First, accelerating industrialization is now threatening the resource space of human civilization through demographic pressure, per capita consumption, and various ecological feedback effects. We know something about how we need to respond to this looming crisis. We could, for instance, boost energy efficiency in numerous devices and machines, find energy sources that don't involve burning fossil fuels, make air travel more expensive, decrease the population size. Careful with that one. Um, Make products that are recyclable and biodegradable, change some of the incentives and structures in the economy to prioritize resource availability over time, leave larger chunks of wilderness to boost wildlife populations, and help with things like flooding, grow food in less mechanized fashion. This is an existential threat, but our religious traditions are not organized to articulate a principled, coordinated response to it, or to offer any real guidance about what this existential threat means spiritually. And if you saw the conversation I had with him, I challenged him on that word spiritually in terms of what do you mean, because he's an atheist. So spiritually in a secular framework needs some careful definition because it can get pretty fudgy pretty fast. It's just one of these words we throw out, and how is it used? I don't know. And we're not currently operating with much of a sense of urgency. What we need is a vision of the future on spiritual grounds that meets these challenges. How could Christianity possibly express such a vision? Now there's a lot to begin with just in terms of this paragraph, and I know some people out there are going to challenge the assumption, and they're going to say things like, well, we've had technological solutions to a whole variety of challenges, one which never gets any mention, but you can read about in a great little book called The Alchemy of Air. He talked about the fixation of nitrogen. Basically, according to that author, the world potentially without chemical fertilizers has a carrying agricultural capacity of 3.5 to 4 billion people, and we've obviously gone far beyond it. One of the consequences of that, of course, has been the upsetting the nitrogen cycle, and there are just a lot more. That has caused algae blooms, a whole bunch of things, because we just put way more nitrogen into the systems. They run off the farms into the rivers. So I'm not in any way challenging the ecological challenges that we face, nor am I necessarily siding with the group who's very much going to be out there that says we will find technical solutions to these problems. And I think Jeff correctly notes that there are a number of technical ways that we can deal with many of the challenges we face. And he notes that, well, there's an existential threat. And now when he uses spiritual here, he's essentially using group motivational. That's how I understand his understanding of spiritual grounds, that we need a people movement, a group motivational movement that can broadly address what I read in here as overconsumption. Now, one of the cases I'm going to make is that overconsumption is currently a product of a spiritual condition. And when I say spiritual condition, I mean a religious condition and a worldview condition. I would suggest that Part of what we're doing is we are consuming at a tremendous rate. We're simply letting our desires run amok and run unrestrained because we are trying to fill up other, dare I say, spiritual needs with consumer goods. So let's dig into this. In some ways, Jeff's argument reminds me of the Brett Weinstein argument that, well, religions, he pretty much grants in their conversation with Sam Harris, he pretty much grants Jordan Peterson's assertion that religious texts have encoded wisdom from past generations, and that's a good thing. And so, unlike Sam Harris, we shouldn't simply dismiss those texts. We should garner from them the wisdom that is in those texts. And I think this is something that John Vervaeke would agree with too, and a good number of people. Now, wisdom has some relevancies and obsolescences. And so what Brett Weinstein asserts is that we have to basically sort them out in order to update our wisdom today. Fair enough. The difficulty, of course, is how we're going to do the sorting. Who's going to do the sorting? What's the process for sorting? Now, to me, this runs right into John Vervaeke's relevance realization that this sorting process has everything to do with how we are in the world, how we read the world, what we can do with the information that's coming in. Wisdom is all about relevance realization and doing that well. So in other words, you need wisdom to sort through your wisdom. And religious traditions, religious texts, giving our ancestors a seat at the table is a very important part of it. The world is no less complex than it has been, but the past was also a very complicated world. We tend to have a foolish bias against the old in the West. Now, I think Jordan Peterson speaks very eloquently about this, because what the old has in its favor is a track record of duration, and bad ideas often tend to lose out over time because enough people have enough wisdom and enough common sense to sort of sort through them. And in a conversation between Adam and Justin Brierley, when Adam was testing his Nazis had to lose World War II because they had a deficient moral system, I agree with Justin Brierley's position that it's really hard to tell these things because what we would consider highly immoral governments and systems have endured for long amounts of time and likely weren't brought down because of the immorality of a specific aspect of their moral worldview either. It's highly complex. It's very difficult to suss out all of these things. Successful things have passed previous tests, and that is something in their favor. And as we work our wisdom, our relevance realization, these are some of the things we need to look at. We should also bear in mind that every generation feels its challenges are exceptional. People often point out with Christianity that Christianity has had an enduring apocalyptic strain to it. Nearly every generation from the time of the New Testament has felt themselves to be living in the end times, and that the close of the age and the end of the world and the return of Jesus is imminent. Now, people might look at that and say, well, either Christians are foolish or the system is corrupt or the system is bad. But I think this basically reflects the normal human understanding that we get scared by the challenges we face, and so we tend to think, well, this is it. That's pretty human to live in that way. Now, part of what went on in the Peterson, Weinstein, Sam Harris conversation was Brett also noted quite rightly and challenged Sam Harris quite rightly that even though you have fundamentalist groups that make a lot of noise about them not changing, really it's very few groups show a clear track record of not changing. I'm thinking of someone perhaps like the Amish, who have in fact resisted much of the technological change. Many of the people who go to highly fundamentalist churches maintain the adoption of many contemporary forms, technologies, entertainments with their own specific religious filter, usually by sort of splitting the world and saying these are religious things over there, these are non-religious things over there, and then they'll usually have a moral line and say, well, we'll watch movies that perhaps have these things in it and not those things in it, these themes and not those themes, but they go to the movies nevertheless. And this, I think, bears in mind the fact that religious people and non-religious people are changing all the time. Now, language such as divine, holy, sacred, inspired that Christians use in referring to the Bible are status indicators. These are words that indicate the where the Bible comes in terms of their worldview hierarchy. But these hierarchies are complicated, and these hierarchies are almost always intertwined by other aspects of their religious tradition that are used to read the text. This is something that if you're deep within a religious tradition and it's your day job, like someone like myself, you're very well aware of. Different groups read and interpret the Bible in different ways. And to groups that say, well, I don't actually read the Bible, I just take it as it is, I've always got a high degree of skepticism because they take some parts as they are and other parts they don't. They have filters, and there are many, many ways that Christians do this. They say, well, this is ceremonial law, so we don't practice that. That was fulfilled in Christ. This is moral law, and we do practice that, but this is culture over here. So those are very long, very detailed conversations, and they very much help religious people continue to live in a relationship with their religious text and their religious tradition and their specific practices of their religion in a context of rapid change. Now, obviously, it's easy to point fingers at some groups and say, you're betraying your system. Well, we're all struggling with those kinds of issues as we go through the day. So religious systems change and change local applications all the time. The kind of Iron Age or Bronze Age immoral examples that are usually pointed out in the Bible from celebrity atheists and the kinds of debates that we see on YouTube are simply not being practiced in churches today, and they wouldn't even be sanctioned as moral in churches today. The situation is far more complex, far more live. But as I think Jordan Peterson said quite well to Sam Harris, the same is true for those who imagine themselves to be living without religion. A lot depends on how you define religion. If you're defining religion as sort of an upfront, obvious appeal to supernatural authorities, well, then maybe you can consider yourself atheistic or not religious. But I'm quite persuaded by a lot of Jordan Peterson's arguments that, in fact, much of this stuff is embedded deeply within our cultural practices, and what is considered moral in the West has been deeply impacted and shaped by the Western tradition that has been deeply impacted and shaped by Christianity itself. Now, in part of my conversation with Jeff, we got a little bit into the challenge of attribution, and this is a constant challenge. What in our society is attributable to Christianity or to the Greeks? I made a video that I couldn't post, basically because of the problems with my software, about Steven Pinker, and Steven Pinker wants to sort of take a scalpel and extract the Enlightenment from the Christian tradition, which historically makes absolutely no sense. The Enlightenment arose because of the Christian tradition. I've talked about that many times on my channel. The Enlightenment arose, I think, partly as a response to the wars of religion between the Protestants and the Catholics, and they're looking for a new ground of certainty. They're looking for a new ground of community, and so they appealed back to some ancient practices such as empiricism and rationalism, or reason. In a sense, Plato up top and Aristotle down below. But all of that was deeply mixed in with everything that had come through the long process of the medieval Christian experience in Europe. And I don't think there's really any legitimate historical way to deny that. And so the world that we live in is a world downstream of Christianity and a whole lot of other things. And Jeff basically challenged the popular line, often by American conservatives, about the Judeo-Christian tradition. There are many things within the Judeo-Christian tradition. All of Roman Catholicism, the Spanish Empire, Latin America. You'd be hard-pressed to try to understand the rise of Marxism outside of the Judeo-Christian religion. It's a response against it, perhaps, but it has much of it within it, including the value systems that get carried on. And so part of what I talked about with Jeff is that, as many have done, you also have to take into account some of the specific history of England and I think also the Netherlands in the molding and shaping of that history. Theology is very much the same way. Theological traditions are also highly complex and different streams come through. They are impacted a whole lot by everything that's coming down the pike. Technological changes, social changes. We live in the midst of all of this. We are highly complex creatures living with an enormous number of motivations and things that are impacting and affecting our lives and decisions and our matrices with which we see the world. The difference between traditions often is the elevation of some aspect over another, but they usually remain in relationship. And again, if you're living in a very complicated religious situation, these things are always with us. And so the difference between Calvinists and Arminians and Roman Catholics and Orthodox, generally a difference in emphases within the hierarchies, within the meaning-making structures of the traditions. And so all of that is a very live situation, and the challenge of attribution remains. Now, one of the most common misunderstandings I find with non-Christians is how Christians imagine the Bible to be. Now, what I'm saying here is not to say that you can't find Christians that, in fact, believe what I'm about to describe. But the Bible is not primarily a rule book. Many imagine that Christianity is what I call something like common religion. Common religion basically says do good and some divine entity or karma or something will reward you. Do bad and you'll be punished. It's sort of a simplistic, low-resolution view of a toddler looking at the world, just having discovered what spankings are about. And they imagine that the Bible gives you rules, follow the rules and God will reward you with heaven, break the rules and God will punish you with hell. That inevitably results in the discussion of where is the line, what are the rules, does God grade on a curve, etc., etc. Many people walk around with this type of understanding of what religion is, and I think it's a low-resolution, fairly common approach to religion, but many people with theological degrees, a better understanding of church history, a better understanding of Christian theology, know that in the majority of the Christian tradition says that the situation is in fact far more complex. The Bible is much better understood as a story we live within. Now, there have been a whole variety of big movements in history, and they come in different types. Religious movements have dramatically changed history. The emergence of Christianity, the Protestant Reformation, the rise of Islam, these things have dramatically changed the map. They've dramatically changed human history in many ways. There have been many smaller religious movements that have really shaped the world. The first and second Great Awakenings, Christian revivals throughout the West. We've seen this pattern again and again. The rise of certain sects that grew out of the burned over district in upstate New York, the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, the Jehovah's Witnesses. Many religious traditions have deeply impacted the shape of the world. Philosophies, Plato, Aristotle, the Stoics, These are other philosophical traditions have acted in many ways like religions and have reshaped the world. Political changes, these are the ones that often get written up in secular histories. Wars, regimes, leaders, on and on, these things change. What we've seen in the last few hundred years, especially since the Industrial Revolution, are technological change. If you read a really wonderful book, 1493, the author goes into what he calls the Columbian Exchange, where we really have the beginning of globalization. And what that led to is what David Courtwright in a recent book calls the Age of Addiction. The Pilgrims settled in the Massachusetts Bay Colony out of a religious desire to establish a city on a hill, to finally live God's way and try out that religious, in fact, a reformed religious experiment in the New World. The Dutch were in the middle of the country, and the Dutch were experimenting with certain economic practices, and so they settled New Amsterdam. But further down, the Jamestown colony, very quickly it was tobacco that changed the South. And then in the pursuit of tobacco, slaves were brought in, but it was the importation of malaria and the fact that West Africans had a much greater degree of immunity to the malaria bug than the indentured servants, who in many ways would have been superior workers in the American South. That kicked off the entire history of African slavery in the American South, and then the rise of cotton, and on and on. Huge changes by technology, sailing technology, markets, industry, on and on and on and on. These big movements have shaped history, and Jeff's challenge comes as basically what the Industrial Revolution and many of these movements have wrought. And again, there's religious threads in here, there's economic threads, there's political threads, the world and world history is a never-ending stream of highly complex things. Now, Jeff really notes this as a sort of spiritual political challenge. And as he said, he's looking for a spiritual solution. And again, I understand that very much in a secular definition, which he's looking for a widespread motivational cultural solution. He is not imagining something that, let's say, a Christian might imagine, that the Holy Spirit is going to blow through, such as something that Christians believe happened in the Roman Empire and how Christianity conquered the Roman Empire. Well, Christians obviously look at that through theistic lenses. Others look at it through other lenses, and to a certain degree, sort of like those little red lenses that you'd put on as a kid to see special text under something in a child's magazine. The filter that you apply will lead to different aspects of recognizing the flow of history. Now, one of the interesting things that I was thinking about back when I did that video on the Democratic debate and the cults of kindness was that these things sort of run through us. And Frankie Schaefer, one of the things that really caught my attention in my conversation with Jeff was when he talked about the failure of, let's say, the evangelical revival that there was in the 60s and 70s and 80s. You know, it came to political manifestation in the rise of the religious right. And Jeff's observation that in some ways that movement failed to live up to its hopes. In many ways, I've talked about that movement before. I think it's integral in terms of the relationship between God number one and God number two, with the continual, I'd say, pushing away of certain aspects of God, what I call God number one. The religious community responded in some ways with a growth of God number two, of the relational God. And you can see this quite clearly, I think, in stories such as Chuck Colson's story, where he'd always gone to church. He had been to be a good culture warrior during the Cold War meant going to church, and being a good American meant going to church. But now he has a personal relationship with Jesus. And whereas a lot of what's happened in the relationship between the mainline and the evangelicals. Much evangelical growth came at mainline expense. Much evangelical growth came because evangelicals offered a way to afford wisdom and often mechanisms to deal with the ravages of, the New Testament calls them epithumia, desires that get overblown. And I think some of these things come together with the meaning crisis. Alcoholism, depression, addictions of various kinds. It's often the case that rigorous conservative religions step in because you need a pretty well functioning vision of what AA calls a higher power in order to deal with the kinds of psychological and behavioral things that might have gotten out of control in manifestation of, let's say, alcohol. And religion, as Jordan Peterson has pointed out many times, religion has for a long time been a powerful agent to help people bring parts of their lives under control that were going out of control and destroying their families, destroying their lives, and in the Vervaeke model, they were losing agency. So what we see in someone like Frank Schaeffer, whose book I read a couple of months ago and really enjoyed, Frank Schaeffer sort of gets swept up by the religious right and that movement, but it's the power and the money and all of the normal corruptors seem to sort of take the legs out for it. And he switches sides politically and becomes kind of a strident voice in the other political direction. But in terms of his religiosity and belief, he's quite a bit more skeptical. But then he settles down in the Orthodox Church, which I find to be a very interesting but not unreasonable thing, given a lot of the trends that I talk about in my videos. Now, another thing that I talked about in that video about the Democratic debates is that I think both the right and the left continually bear temptations towards a totalitarian solution. And you could see this, for example, in China's one-child policy. The difficulty with these totalitarian solutions, as Piaget noted and Jordan Peterson has brought out, that there are heavy carrying costs for these types of approaches. There's always corruption to deal with in these totalitarian governments because your motivational structures are not really aligned with your governing structures. For a culture and their system of government to really be functioning well, in many ways, the vision behind the government needs to be in some alignment with the worldview vision and the religious vision of the people themselves. In my Sunday school class last week, I was talking about the Pharisees and some of the religious political motivations of the Pharisees. The Pharisees are these partners, conversation partners of Jesus, and often adversaries. And I made the distinction that often politics, well, how are we to kind of figure out the relationship between politics and religion? Well, one way to do it is to get a sense of speed or time. Politics is always about the now, and religion is about the always. And their domains cross quite a bit because your solutions to the now are very much dependent on your worldview and very much dependent upon your imagined solutions to the always. And so for this reason, Jeff's question, I think, is a good one in terms of does Christianity have resources that can address the kinds of challenges we face today? I think this in many ways is also the question behind John Vervaeke's project of trying to construct a religion without religion, something that is better compatible with current cognitive science and something that is better compatible with basically a scientific worldview. That's how I understand John's project, and John and I are very upfront with each other about our disagreement. I don't think Christianity is now obsolete, and merely a move towards nostalgia. I think it continues to be a viable option, and John doesn't. And that's just the nature of disagreement. And if we can have disagreement and actually talk about it, I think that usually there's a lot both sides can learn from the interchange, which is why part of the reason I make videos. So totalitarian solutions to these challenges that Jeff brings forward, I don't think really offer a good way forward because their carrying costs are simply too heavy. Now, in the West, we tend to look to markets, and markets are powerful, but there's some question as to whether AI is going to really disrupt the markets. You can listen to Eric Weinstein ponder those kinds of issues on his podcast. They're powerful, but markets also tend to be severe, and they are unequal by definition, and those inequalities can, in fact, produce instabilities, and that causes problem too. But what's beneath a lot of this is the fact that, in fact, desire makes the world go round. And it was the desire for tobacco, and the desire for sugar, and the desire for opium, and the desire for wealth, and the desire for stability, and the desire for many, many things that actually motivates people. And so when Jeff is looking for a spiritual solution, as I said, a secular understanding of that spiritual solution really gets into a motivational solution. And one of the things that we're going to have to deal with is, in fact, motivations for desire and common desires for short-term goods. These kinds of things motivate us to make as much money as we can so that we can spend as much money on ourselves as we can. And this is obviously a big part of the problem if you're in a freedom-oriented, market-oriented situation like we have in the West. And again, as I said, I don't think totalitarian solutions are good ones. I think they are overly corrupt. I think they are overly simplistic. And I think part of what we saw sorted out in the 20th century with respect to communism was that it simply lost the competition to markets because markets are smarter. But what we've also done in the West is try to moderate some of the impacts of markets, especially with respect to inequality, because if inequality gets too high, then you tend to get instability, you tend to get revolutions, and for the most part, none of these are ultimate goods, but many of these things are relative goods, and stability is a very strong relative good if we're going to be able to make the kind of rational, and I think we should try to look for rational solutions to many of these challenges that face us. But again, we're going to need something that addresses us on the motivational level. One of the things I want to reach down into is this. Okay, if we're going to be dealing with a spiritual solution or a religious solution, Jeff wants to know if Christianity has the resources. I'm going to reach back to a Puritan named Thomas Chalmers, who made this observation. The best way to overcome the world, and what he means by the world are these desires that fester within us. And sometimes, even if these desires are sort of normally in place, we can overconsume. We have very little restraint because we say, consumption makes me happy. And perhaps I'm compensating for a lack of a spiritual life with material acquisition. Okay? And I am, in fact, endangering, well, you see this in parenting. So husband and wife get divorced, and so the wife is basically raising the kid. How does the husband compensate? With stuff. How does the wife compensate the kid for their losses? With stuff. There's a lot going on here, and so if we're going to address human motivation, we have to understand how motivation works. And the Puritans actually did a lot of thinking about motivation because they set very high standards for behavior. They were often frustrated by it, and in fact, Puritans have in some way developed a reputation of being stern and disciplined, but they in fact did make a pretty good science out of it. And so Thomas Chalmers, in his sermon, The Expulsive Power of a New Affection, says this: the best way to overcome the world is not with morality or self-discipline. Now, what I tend to find with many secular attempts is that shaming or blaming, shaming, or rewarding morality tends to be their primary means of self-control and social control. And we see this all the time in social media. We have all these little catchphrases where we try to shame each other, and we call people by names, and we say, you're better than that, or all kinds of ways we try to name and shame people into moral behavior. And one of the things that I believe Christianity and the Puritan divines understood is that this doesn't work, because you're essentially working upon the pride of individuals. And if you work upon their pride and you build up that pride, well, maybe you'll retard some of these behaviors that you're trying to reduce over here, but by building up what they understood as pride. Now, pride is a very complicated word, and I mean it in a fairly specific way. By building up the pride, you're actually going to increase duplicity and covert behavior. You're going to try and look good out in public, but your private life is going to be a mess. I just restarted the Jordan Peterson commentary on the biblical series, and I think at the beginning of his first The Idea of God video, his first of the biblical series, he talks quite well of the fact that the appearances up above are dependent upon all of the stuff that's hidden below. And of course, Jung talked about that in terms of the shadow. Christians have talked about this in many ways. The Apostle Paul talks about it in Romans 7. And so what the Puritans said is actually the way to live an integrated life that's in alignment and actually pursuing your worldview. Now, this is a very difficult thing because we are very complex creatures, is in fact not to try to always suppress all of your little desires, but in fact to harness desire by having a specific desire overwhelm the others. One definition of sin is that it is simply a waste of time. And if your primary desire is a very good thing, in fact, a lot of good things can come. Now, I will also argue in Christianity that the only safe ultimate desire you have has to be outside and above the secular realm. Because whenever we locate our ultimate desire as something within the secular realm, we actually corrupt that thing which we desire, and we destroy many of the elements in the way of desiring. For example, if someone says, family is my number one priority, family is certainly a wonderful priority. Family is a terrific priority. But if you make family your number one priority, what you will soon learn is that you have put too much weight on family, and that weight will cripple it. The same thing happens with respect to my number one priority is my romantic attachment. When you make Denial of Death by, it's Becker, I believe. It's a book that Jordan Peterson mentions a number of times. John Vermeke makes exactly the same point. A single person cannot bear the weight of the center and the top of your hierarchy of desire. You need something incorruptible above it, which is why, in a sense, we say, well, the president must be below the law, because the president of the United States must always obey the law. And the president of the United States, when the president is sworn in, swears allegiance to the Constitution. Okay? So they put themselves beneath something. So what Thomas Chalmers says, the best way to overcome the world is not with moral or self-discipline. Christians overcome the world by seeing the beauty and excellence of Christ. They overcome the world by seeing something more attractive than the world, which is Christ. Now, while I was making this PowerPoint for this video, I was thinking about doing a commentary on the conversation with Justin Brierley and Adam Friended, because one of the things that I noted is that Justin used this language, and the difficulty of this language is that if you just say something about Jesus and loving Jesus, it doesn't translate very well, and it doesn't communicate very well. But I'm risking that by using Thomas Chalmers here, but by saying that what you actually need is a desire outside the world that we point to, and that helps, in fact, keep all of the rest of the hierarchy in line and pointing in the proper direction. Your desires can't be destroyed, they must be dispossessed, and a stronger desire pushes aside the weaker ones and in fact aligns the weaker ones and lets them be in proper arrangement. Some of you who know Augustine will recognize this move. This is the idea of ordered loves. And in other words, you should be committed to your family. Your family is a good thing, but it's not an ultimate thing. You should be committed to your spouse. Your spouse is a good thing, but not an ultimate thing. You should be committed to, it's a fine thing to be committed to a decent home and treating and raising your children well and not living in poverty. Those are fine things, but they're not ultimate things. And if you make them ultimate things, in a sense, you lose everything else. Now, people will always live out of a narrative. And what I would say is that Christianity, as I said before, is not so much a set of rules. Those rules that we find in the Bible, certainly they were established in other ages, but what Christians have done for a very long time in terms of pastors and preachers is they have looked at those rules, they have looked at the narratives, they have looked at the practices, and what they have tried to do is find application for the principle behind them in the world today. And Christians are doing that all the time, which is why there is theology, which is why there is preachers. There are preachers, and is why I make videos. So one of the things that I think Christianity has to offer is that Christianity, at least in my estimation, has a good mixture of a desire for the common good. Jesus commands us to love our neighbors all the way up to and including our enemies and to take care of the poor. And this is all expressed in, let's say, the New Testament's one of the New Testament's most famous verses, John 3:16, for God so loved the world, even in the Gospel of John, where the world is something, in a sense, a bit alien and in rebellion to God. It's God's generosity from the top of the hierarchy for those lower in the hierarchy that makes up the heart of the Christian story. Jesus, who is the Son of God, is at the top of the hierarchy, and he goes to the bottom to become the servant of all. And because he in fact does that and seeks the good of the centurions, the non-Jews, even his political enemies, he forgives those who crucify him, and because of this he goes back to the top of the hierarchy. And in fact, that is embedded in the Christian story. And a lot of the good that we've seen in the West, I believe, even though we have the challenge of attribution, a lot of the good we've seen in the West is the working out of that. In fact, this whole fuel behind the victim culture, that is a result of Christianity, of Christians saying that the poor and the victims care and matter to God. Now, exactly how you work that out, that's going to be more complicated, and there's obviously going to be disagreement and conversation, but the principle is there, and it comes from Christianity. So what we find in Christianity is a worldview that, in fact, has the flexibility of caring for the secular realm while maintaining the realm above the secular that can keep the secular in proper orientation for the sake of the secular. Now, Christianity, what common good does your narrative happen? See, I think part of the problem that we're experiencing is, in fact, that secular narratives are not helping us deal with our own desires. In fact, I think part of rampant consumerism is a reaction to secularism. We are trying to use cars and money and all of these kinds of things to secure for us happiness, security, status, because all we have is this world. And I would assert that secularism actually makes you more selfish. I had a conversation with one person who didn't want to record the conversation or share it publicly, at least I'm not sharing any details of it, but what he brought to me was essentially what many others have brought to me, because he says, when I'm listening to the atheists, I think, well, all that really matters, what's at the top of my hierarchy, is getting as much joy and happy experience out of the world today. And what that leads me to is to say, well, we're destroying the environment. I can't help that. I'm not going to have any children. So therefore, I don't have any children to worry about in the future. I am going to have as good a time in this world as I can, and I'm going to enjoy it. And, well, that's basic hedonism. Others will listen to that and say, oh, that's immoral. Okay, on what basis is it immoral? Well, again, as I thought was really well handled in the Justin Brierley conversation, your vision of morality is very much dependent on your vision of the good. And so if you say humanity must be preserved, well, that's governing your morality. And, well, now you're going to be pursuing that. So you say, okay, so I'm not going to consume so much out of deference to future generations. Lovely. I'm happy for that. Does your worldview actually afford and support that perspective? And what, in fact, are your motivations for pursuing that perspective? I would suggest that many of your motivations are, in fact, self-righteous. This is something that the Puritans, again, had a pretty good handle on. And your self-righteous motivations will cause some other dynamics, in fact, conflict. In fact, you will be bent towards totalitarianism because, well, there's no God or higher spiritual forces that could actually afford hope. And so therefore, you're going to have to suppress those people. And it's going to lead to more totalitarian solutions for the kind of challenge that Jeff has posted here. So, does your worldview make you more selfish? Does it prioritize you over others and getting it now? Does it easily allow you to look down on others, justifying what you really want anyway? And I would say that in today's moral economy, the real fuel it's running on is self-righteousness and status. It's all about me. And in fact, looking righteous has a high social status in our current social status economy. But self-righteousness has some tricks to it. And what happens with self-righteousness, well, nobody likes a self-righteous person. And nobody enjoys people acting self-righteously. And I see this working out in woke religion, for example, because it's an extremely self-righteous religious movement, and it tends to turn people off pretty quickly, and it tends to fragment pretty quickly, because it's easy to be self-righteous, let's say, about, well, I'm driving a Prius, and I'm giving money for the rainforest, and I'm doing this thing, but okay, so the environment is at the center of your meaning matrix and your priority. Another person over here will say, no, race should be at the center of the priority. Another person over here will say, no, this other evil should be at the center of the priority. And what it tends to do is fragment. And that's why it's always more helpful to have something on the top of the hierarchy which is actually out of the game, because otherwise any of these competing interests tend to run to the top, and that then reshapes the hierarchy beneath it. And so if your system is fueled by self-righteousness, you'll tend to get religious self-righteousness, you'll tend to get moral self-righteousness, and social media just pours gas on the fire. Self-righteousness too often leads to justifications for violence, marginalization, social shaming, bullying, and often totalitarian regimes. We must save this world, even though you know that in the long run, you're looking at the heat death of the universe. An asteroid could come and destroy it. Maybe your political enemies are going to win, and in fact, you've arranged your politics around something within your hierarchy. That's exactly what you see, let's say, in Nazi regimes. They had an idea of racial evolution, and they put that at the top of their hierarchy. Class struggle was put at the top of the Marxist hierarchy. But every time you have to create a utopia here below, trying to bring down heaven means you bring up hell. And you have to have a totalitarian system, and you have all of these dynamics of self-righteousness. And so, in fact, what you need is a system that isn't based on self-righteousness. The top of the hierarchy is, in fact, outside of the scrum within the secular realm. And you need something that will, in fact, humble people into joyful service, which affords a reward that is, in fact, of higher value because it's imagined to be eternal. The Christian life is self-sacrificial. It's something for the welfare of the world. You're commanded by your Lord to love your enemies, even the ones who are persecuting you. Pray for the ones who persecute you. Jesus from the cross asks forgiveness for those who are crucifying him. The promise is in the next dispensation to come. Now, again, secularists look at that and say, well, that's a flaw. And I'd say, no, it's actually a feature. Because, as Miroslav Volf points out, in the decaying communist Yugoslavia, as it was tearing itself apart in the Civil War, those who wanted justice needed to have justice now, which meant they had blood on their own hands. Actually, if you're a Christian, you believe in a God who judges, and that God, in fact, will sort out the messes we make down here below at a future time. Now, you might say, well, that's sort of a fairy tale. Yeah, but if you believe it, it actually affords you the ability to love your enemies and, in fact, to speak more civilly to them and to talk instead of fight, even when it comes to losing and even when it comes to losing your life. And you might say, well, this doesn't seem a very viable solution. Well, it worked in the Roman Empire. The blood of the Christians became the seed of the church. And so Christians work for the welfare of this world from the promise of the next, not out of fear, but out of love. And those are very different motivations. Part of the issue that I see with this challenge from Jeff is it's fear-based. Fear is tricky because a little bit of fear can maybe motivate you to a certain point. Enough fear tends to paralyze you, and then you tend to fall into escapism. And escapism will tend to be expressed in your pattern of desire. If you're looking for escape, it might be in alcohol. It might be in sex. It might be in the shopping network. It might be in all of these things. In other words, I think, as I said before, there's a relationship between this particular challenge and the secular frame. That this particular challenge is quite likely an expression of the secular frame. And I think what Christianity has to offer is, in fact, the hope for people living modest lives, serving their neighbors, and not looking for all of the baubles of this world bringing utopia down, which tends to bring a hell up. And you might say, well, what about evidence? I would say, look to Gallup, a number of years, wrote a book called The Saints Among Us. And what he noted was that committed Christian people, the kind of Christians who go to church, who give to their church, what do? They, in fact, volunteer at higher levels than non-churchgoers. They give money even to secular organizations at higher levels than non-churchgoers. They live modestly, more modestly than non-churchgoers. There's a lot of evidence that Christianity, in fact, has this effect on people. They live more modestly. They give more money to other causes. They give more time to other causes. Out of what? Well, if you're an atheist, you might say, well, out of some imaginary future. And you're like, yeah, and you're benefiting from it. Now, you might ask yourself, who would you rather have as your neighbor? Would you like to have a Christian who is living a modest lifestyle, is generous towards you? Or would you rather have a hedonist? Well, in some ways, hedonists are predictable because they tend to be consumed by their epithumia, but whatever over-desire is welling up in their hearts. And again, the Puritans did a lot of interesting study and a lot of interesting writing on these dynamics. So Christians live self-sacrificially for the welfare of this world, from the promise of the next, not out of fear, and failure won't deter them. Christians know how to lose and keep living. Don't look down. And Christians also, if in fact they believe they are saved by grace and not from works, They don't look down on their neighbors because they can say, I haven't received forgiveness from God for my sins because I'm any better than anyone else, but this has been, in fact, God's love expressed to me. So I can't look down on those who are perhaps not living up to the standards I hold to myself, because grace is unearned. Now, this has happened many times throughout history. Rodney Stark has written some very interesting books about the rise of Christianity, and these books are sociological books asking the question, how did this little sect coming out of Judea conquer the Roman Empire in a couple of hundred years? Well, they did it through basically love. Christians treated women better than the classical pagans. Christians treated girls better. Christians would not only care for their own sick when the plagues hit, but would care for the sick of the pagans. Christians not only would care for the poor within their own churches, but Christians would care for the poor outside of their churches. And for all the failures of the church, that remains true today. When someone is in need, they come and knock on this door right over here. AM/PM has plenty of beer and food. Bel Air has plenty of beer and food. Where do they come? Even if they're just looking for beer and food, they come to the church. Why? Because the church has a reputation for serving the poor. When an AA group is looking for a place to meet, where do they look? Why? Because churches have opened their doors to them. When people get in trouble, even if they don't go to church at all, where do they look for help? To the church. Why? Because Christians have been doing this for a very, very long time. Even when times get bad, Christians multiply. In fact, sometimes Christians multiply, especially when times get bad and hard. And so I would again assert that Christianity, in fact, has ample resources to address the challenges that we face. I can't make that. I'm used to making the box bigger at the end of the video, and I can't easily do that. So, Jeff, there's an answer to your challenge, and we'll see what you think about it. I'll work on challenge number 2 as well.